All right, we're now going to move on from celebrities and come down to earth a little and look at something called JSON. Now, if you haven't seen it before, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Even though it's got JavaScript in the name, it's not actually specific to the language JavaScript in any way. It was developed to be able to pass information between websites or between pages on websites, but it's grown really to become one of the standard ways of passing information around the web. So JSON and XML are really the two most commonly used ways of passing information from one program to another. So JSON basically looks like this. It's surrounded by those curly brackets we're so familiar with, and then this is a bit like an array. We've got an employees object here, and then that's essentially an array of first names and last names. So we can extract the information here, and basically we've got a bunch of employees and we can get their first names and last names. So all JSON is a way of setting out data that can be processed by our programming language, in this case Java, to allow us to get the information and then do something with it. The reason that JSON is so important is because APIs, that is application programming interfaces, are great ways to add features to your apps. So if you wanted to make a weather app, for example, as we're going to be doing in the next lecture, you would need to get some weather information. Now, one way to do that would be to set up your own weather company and set up weather stations all around the world. More straightforward, though, would be to use a pre-existing system, and there are lots of APIs available completely free for you to use. We're going to be using one called openweathermap.org because it meets our requirements and it's free to use. It does say here that you need to sign up for an API key, so do that if you want to, but I've actually found that on very low usage, we can use it without an API key at all. APIs, of course, aren't just about weather, but pretty much all the big major services like Google Maps, Facebook, Twitter, almost anything that you could want to plug into with your app will have an API that you can use. So being able to work with APIs and JSON is extremely valuable. Before we go over to Android Studio and make our app, let's just have a quick look and see what the weather data looks like on openweathermap.org. And here, this is one of the reasons that we're going to be using this system, because it allows us very flexibly to just put in a city name and then get the weather for that city. So if, for example, we go to the website api.openweathermap.org/data/2.5/weather and then $Q equals London, that will give us in API form the weather in London. Right now, not particularly inspiring, but it is the precise data that we need, and then we can extract that and put it into our app. So you might be guessing what the first challenge is going to be. Very simply, I want you to use the code that we've used a few times now to download the contents of this URL. You don't need to process them or anything yet. I'll show you how to do that later on, but just use the code that we've had so far, which now should be reasonably solidly in your head, or at least hopefully it will be after this exercise, to download the contents of this within your app. Go for it. All right, I hope that went okay. I'm going to, as usual, start with a new project, and we'll call this JSON demo. All the usual settings, nothing strange or different here. And here we go. We're not interested in the design of this one. We're going to do everything in mainActivity.java as before. So let's start with our download task. So it's a public class. We'll call it the same as before, download task, and it extends async task. By the way, when you're writing code like this, it's a great idea to just talk through what you're doing. Even though you might feel like a crazy person, it's a really good idea to just remind yourself what exactly is async task doing, what are these parameters that we're about to put in, etc., rather than just mindlessly repeating the code that you've learnt before. So async task allows us to run a task on the background thread, which is a great idea if we're doing something that might take a long time, like downloading some web content. we're going to pass the class a string. We don't need to do anything whilst the task is in progress, and we want it to return a string as well. That should then give us an error. There it is. And that error is that we're missing the doInBackground method. So we'll just get Android Studio to put it in for us. Okay, so the var args we're going to rename to URLs. And then, just as before, we'll create an empty string to store our results. We'll create a URL called URL. To store our URL. And we'll create an HTTP URL connection called URL connection, which initially will be empty or null. Then we'll create our URL as a new URL from the URL that we're passing to the method, which is going to be the first one in var args, so URL's 0. That could fail if it's not a valid URL, so we need to surround it with try and catch. There we go. And then we're going to set up the URL connection using URL.openConnection, and to make sure that that's of the right type, we need to cast it to HTTP URL connection. That could fail as well, so we're going to add the catch clause to our try catch setup. Then we create our input stream called in. We get that from URL connection.get input stream. Then we create our input stream reader called reader, which is a new input stream reader from our input stream in. Then we create our data variable, which we're going to use to read the contents of our reader. So reader.read. And then we create a while loop, which will run as long as data is not equal to -1. And that's each time going to create a current character, which we're going to get from casting data to a character or a char. Then we'll take result and append the current character to it. Whoops. Using plus, not exclamation mark. And finally, we'll take data and get it to read the next character. There we go. And then when we've finished all that, we'll return result. Now I'm going to shake this up very slightly and show you another way that we can work with result rather than passing it back to the main thread and then getting the main thread to work with it. And that is to use another default method called onPostExecute. There it is. So we get all the default setup. And essentially what this method is a method that is called when the when the doInBackground method has completed. and it will be passed the whatever we return from the doInBackground method, so hopefully the result. And difference between the onPostExecute method and the doInBackground method is that the doInBackground method can't interact with the UI at all. So I don't know if you've experimented with this, but if you try and update a label, for example, in the doInBackground method, it won't work, because that should only be done in the UI thread, the main thread, or in onPostExecute. Here, we could update the UI. We don't actually need to. All we're going to do is log I website content and result. And notice we've got an error there because it refers to the string as S. I think I'll call it result, just to keep everything the same. Okay, so now all we need to do is call our download task method on create, and we'll do that in the usual way using download task to create our new task, and this is a new download task, and then we'll run it using task.execute, and then I think in my clipboard I've still got the URL that we need. And this time we don't need to display the result or log it here because it's already logged within the within the async task download task extension. Alright then, so let's give that a shot. Just to note, we haven't done anything new yet. We haven't actually processed the JSON data. All we've done is got the contents of this URL, which is something that we have done before. But now we should be pretty much expert at it, and we should hopefully understand what all of these individual bits are doing. And just before we run it, let's not forget to put the request in the manifest. So users permission and android.permission.internet. All right, here we go. And there it is. There's our content. So coordinates, London, weather, etc., etc. Fantastic. So first part's done. So let's see how we process this information. So the part that we're going to be interested in is this weather part here. We're not particularly interested in the coordinates of the location. We're going to be interested in the weather part. So first of all, how do we extract that? Well, our first step is to convert this, which is currently just a string, into actual JSON data. And we can do that in Java using JSON object, which creates a JSON object for us from a string, which I'll call JObject, or let's call it JSON object, why not? And this is going to be a new JSON object created from the result string. Now that of course might well fail if the result string is empty, for example, or if this is malformed JSON. So if there's a problem with this JSON, then it won't be able to convert it into a JSON object. So you can imagine what we're going to have to do with that. Surround it with try and catch. There we go. So we're catching the possibility that this JSON object is bad, essentially. So once we've got our JSON object, we can then extract particular parts from it. Say we wanted just this weather part here. Then we can take our JSON object and we can get a string from it. And the string that we want to get has a name of weather. So that will then extract the weather part of the JSON object. So then let's try just logging that instead of logging the whole thing. So we'll change this to weather content, and let's give it a name. So this is going to be a string, and we'll call it weather info. Okay. So now we should get a fairly similar result to this, but we won't have the coordinates part. We'll only have the weather part. So it should start with ID and then have main, description, etc. And just while that's compiling, it's worth mentioning why this is better than what we were doing in the previous videos, because this is a particular structure that this API has created for us. So it's very unlikely that the API are just going to change the structure and break our app. Whereas the Posh24 website had no reason not to change their HTML. And if they did change their HTML, that would break our app. So it's much better to use APIs rather than direct scraping from the web if you possibly can. But knowing how to use both is very useful. Okay. Let's see if we can find our code. There it is. Wonderful. So as I said, it starts with ID and then gets each part here. So now we have a new challenge. We need to extract the individual content from each of these. So notice that what we've got here is a summary of mini JSONs. So we've got here an ID of 521, a main of rain, and a description of proximity shower rain, and an icon of 09D. Then we've got a similar bunch of content, but with drizzle. So ID of 310, main of drizzle, description, light intensity drizzle rain. So we need to find a way to loop through all of that to get that information. So as usual with programming, there's a number of different ways we could do it, but I'm going to do it in the way that I think is simplest. And that is by initially taking our weather info, which is this whole long string here, and converting it into a JSON array. So we do that using JSON array. I'll call it ARR, short for array. And this is a new JSON array from weather info. Okay. The reason I can do that here is because this is set up as an array. We've got an initial object here, which is our first object in the array, and then we've got a second object, etc. That might not be possible depending on the structure of your JSON, but if it looks like this and is just a collection of objects without any hierarchies or different sections or anything like that, then you can use JSON array. And once we've got an array, we can just loop through it. So we can use a for loop. We'll have an I, which is initially 0. We'll keep going as long as I is less than the length of the array. And obviously we'll increment I each time. And then within each of these, we need to convert each of these to a separate JSON object, all of their own. So we'll create a new JSON object. I'll call it JSON part because it's a part of the whole JSON. And we get that from the array, which remember is a JSON array, an array of JSONs, and get JSON object. And we want the ith object. So we're just looping through, and this will convert each part in turn to a JSON object. And once we've got that, we can do the same thing that we did up here, use get string to get the individual bits that we want. So we're not particularly interested in the ID, but we are interested in the main, whatever type of weather that is, and we are interested in the description as well. So let's grab those. For now, we'll just log them. So main is going to be JSON part dot get string, whoops, main, and then the same thing for description. So JSON part dot get string description. And I think we should have selected the wrong one there. Okay, so it's a slightly laborious process going through and finding all the bits that we want, but once that's been processed, we should be able to access all of the different parts of the JSON that we're interested in, which in our case is just the main and the description. And there we go, you can see we've got it there. So it seems to be returning slightly different things each time. That's probably just because this haze is coming in and out. So we've got rain is now moderate rain, haze is haze, and we've got thunderstorm this time, proximity thunderstorm. So there we go, we've now extracted the content. And this is very much a general purpose script that you can use to process any type of JSON. And then at this point, you can do what you like with it, really. Usually we might want to put it into an array list or something else so that we can access it later on. But that will do for now. We're now going to move on with this and create our What's the Weather app.